A little known fact about James Joyce is that he had a kink or a fetish for women's underpants. And this finally becomes the context for an entire chapter in the first chapter of Book 2 of Finnegans Wake, The Mime of the Mick, Nick, and the Maggies. And in this chapter, Shem, in the guise of a new character, Glug as he's called, is asked to come up and try to guess the color of Isabel and her 29 rainbow girls' panties. And the correct answer here is heliotrope. But this word proves totally ambiguous in the chapter, first off because it has a number of different possible meanings and associations, such that any one guess is technically inadequate because it's not grasping the entirety of the other meanings. It could be seen as deficient or sliding by without getting at the facts straight on, without understanding the facts of feminine clothiering, as it's called. And I think that phrase is really important because it shows how even the enveloping structure of a text is always erring, always in a process of différance, as Derrida would put it. In this video, I would like to think and theorize about Finnegans Wake as a kinky text, which is to say, concerned with the word or concept kink in the double sense of a sexual fetish, or something sexually unorthodox, and a kind of knot or sharp bend or twist in something that would otherwise be straight, such as a garden hose, right? And this cuts off the flow of something that would otherwise be there. Thus, a kink is a discontinuity, a rupture, or a lacuna. And I'll go back to those latter three later in the lecture, but right now I want to focus on how we can explicate the nature of kink, fetish, and desire as a fundamental linguistic trope and vehicle in Finnegans Wake. One of the reasons this concept is so important here is because it really gets at the relationship between Joyce as author and us as readers. Is he our friend here, trying to invite us in? Or is he our foe, trying to keep us at bay with various tropes and defensive mechanisms? Because one thing we know about the dream of Finnegans Wake is that it is filled with repression, and thereby the only way that we can get a sense of presence is through a deferred chain of differential marks, as Derrida would put it. And in this process, there are a number of psychic mechanisms used to distance the dreamer from his or her own concepts, ideas, and preoccupations. Thus, Finnegans Wake's language is, by definition, oblique. It works by extension and temporal deferral. As such, it makes language kinky as well, by showing the kinks already present in language. In all forms of discourse, it shows that they are partial, which is a term that I use often on the channel. Partial in the sense of gap-laden and biased, right? So this weaponizes language and discourse itself by making it a poignant vehicle for desire, and thereby also for all the different manifestations that desire can take. Excess, disgust, fear, repression, anxiety, depression, and more. Therefore, Finnegans Wake is not speaking for some teleological understanding of the mind or of the world. As Sheldon Brivik says, the discourse of Finnegans Wake accommodates multitudes. It speaks for multiple voices. It genuinely tries to accommodate the difference that is sort of latent within our conception of desire as excess and overflowing beyond rational categories. As such, the geometry of Finnegans Wake, in its sort of desirous turning over and mulling over itself, is that of a Möbius strip. And a Möbius strip is an otherwise circular structure with a half-twist in it, such that it intertwines with itself. It is interrelated and interdependent to itself. It has two sides which are really the same side of the same structure. Thus, it is the Ouroboros, but twisted again in another dimension that the Ouroboros geometry hasn't typically allowed for. As such, this is not only the geometry of the text, but also the nature of the reader-writer network. He is constantly twisting and pulling his readers' legs, trying to get them to go down rabbit holes just like the characters. And yet at the same time, he's thereby inviting them in to the character's unconscious and letting the characters' minds run free. And we are thereby implicated in this process. And this idea of implication is really interesting because implicate comes from late Middle English, and before that from the Latin implicatus, for folded in, the past participle of implicare. And the original sense of implicate is to intertwine. So we have a very interesting case here, where the reader has to actively construct a text that is not formally there before the reading begins. Right? There are sort of loose structural indices, markers and signs that point us in certain directions, but they work at best probabilistically. They don't give us sense certainty. They merely give us rabbit holes to go down. They give us lines of flight, as Deleuze-Guattari would call it. This accords with Gabriel Rengli's theory of spectral authorship, which he elaborates in Joyce's theory, Hermeneutic Ethics in Derrida, Lacan, and Finnegans Wake. And this text goes to a great deal to try to explain the nature of authorship in deconstruction. Because Barthes famously theorized the death of the author. But Renggli actually wants to say that no, the author is not dead. Even Derrida acknowledged this. The author is just there as a trace, or as Renggli calls it, a specter. Therefore, there is no mode of speaking that remains undistorted by iterability and ventriloquism, he says. Whenever it is consulted, authorities' pronouncements emerge as the result of a negotiation that already mixes and confuses positions. And beneath this dynamic of displacement, there is a mechanism at work that divides even the author from any interpretive authority in the sense of total mastery over what they produce. Right, so we're getting this implicated nature of the Möbius form, right? Where both sides are really both different and the same at the same time. He says language refuses to codify a single authentic intention without also dividing it, wrenching it from itself, and transforming it in multiple and unpredictable ways. Therefore, authorial meaning, he says, far from constituting a pragmatic solution that cuts through the paradoxes of those terms, is a concept structurally analogous to them. We call something a meaning intended by the author with reference to certain textual effects. The impossibility of distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate effects with absolute certainty, therefore, means that the author, too, is a presence constituted by our interpretive decisions. And this idea of decision-making is really important for Renggli because he says that any theory of interpretation demands that there is some fundamental discontinuity between the text and the interpretation that results. Right? That we can't get a one-to-one correspondence between the data, quote-unquote, of the text, of the empirical facts of the matter, to the specter that we invent, that we claim speaks for Joyce and in Joyce's voice. As we're doing that, we are constructing retrospectively what we see as being the most authentic image of Joyce, which is itself based upon a number of decisions and assumptions, none of which can be exhausted. And this is what's crucial here for our understanding of the relationship between Joyce and therefore his fetish and the way that this implicates us in a discourse of desire, is that conceptualizing authority as spectral underlines our implication in the text as producers of meaning. On the other hand, the powers that specters nonetheless wield, including powers of dictation, can tell us that if the meaning thus produced is not neatly divisible into elements that partake and elements that do not partake in the authority bestowed by an authorial blessing, this does not mean that the notion of authority is abandoned. Joyce still leaves something for us. How did we get Finnegans Wake otherwise? What divides our readings from authority is the uncertainty of their relation to it. And this uncertainty cuts both ways. It perpetuates authority in the very act of putting it into question, right? Just as the Möbius strip perpetuates each side while effacing it in the process. Like Derrida's Plato, who inventing Socrates takes on a debt and responsibility towards the fictional father figure, The reader who is at the risk of usurping the position to be consulted is also tied to this position as the one to be iterated and interacted with this. And I think this is very interesting, right? That we are interacting with Joyce in a fundamental way. We're having some sort of conversation, but rather than it being a dialogue, it is a polylogue. And this is a word that Finnegans Wake uses many times, in fact, in varying guises. That we are using multiple different languages, multiple different discourses to try to understand the lack of any meta discourse. That there is no one trope, no one schema, no one matrix that can subsume the entirety of any text, and thus of any mind, or anything that desires, and try to reduce it to set mechanisms. Desire is, by its very definition, productive in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, and therefore always exceeding any single gesture, because desire must repeat itself. It must propagate itself, properly speaking. It's a sort of virus that goes beyond any one logic, that is able to evolutionarily accompany and accommodate any environment or vehicle. But Patrick A. McCarthy clarifies in his essay a warping process, which can be found in Work in Progress Joyce Centenary essays, that Joyce and his reader are ultimately partners, not antagonists. If the reader cannot hope to understand exactly what Joyce meant when he wrote the book, it is equally true that the book lives only in the experience of its readers and has no set meaning apart from that experience, right? So we're needed. Why would Joyce write this and spend 17 years on it if he didn't want it to be read? Although he makes many demands on his readers, Joyce accords them a place of honor, in keeping with Stern's dictum that the truest respect which you can pay to the reader's understanding is to have this matter amicably, and leave him something to imagine as well as yourself. Precisely so. And it is this reliance on the reader's cooperation, not to mention his goodwill, knowledge, sense of humor, patience, and insomnia, that defines Joyce's attitude towards his audience. Right? So there's a mix of leg pulling, of occulting, while at the same time a sense of charitability and relationship. Because Joyce is fundamentally infatuated with relationships, and he wants to see that the readership that we engage in is one of a relationship with textuality, with a fulminating, excessive medium that tries to tell us things without communicating facts. Right? Without claiming that what happens in Finnegans Wake somehow corresponds to a world. No, it is beyond correspondence. It is, in a sense, a world of its own, isolated, and yet at the same time, it always opens up and demands that it be opened up. That's why every time I'm next to Finnegans Wake, I just have to open up a passage and just read something, because it just compels me. And this is a fundamentally desirous impulse, right? That we want to implicate ourselves in the text, and the text wants to implicate itself in us. That's why there's so much self-reflexivity and doubt in Finnegans Wake. Therefore, the kinky text of Finnegans Wake opens up and exposes kinks, and analyzes them as indeterminate spaces between any 2 points, that allows for play. Play conceived of in the dual sense of fun, like playing a game, but also play as in the quality of limited free reign between two, like, machined parts, for example, right? There's a little space of play in between where it can sort of jiggle around. There is a sort of limited movement allowed between relative fetters. These two aspects of play are really key to understanding the relationship of Joyce to kinks. Because at once we can see that Joyce is kind of, in a sort of flagellatory manner, playing with himself. Therefore, it's of course sexually explicit and filled with innuendo. And yet at the same time, he's also playing with us in the sense of perhaps exciting us sexually, but also playing with us in the sense of two members of some common game. But thirdly, playing at our expense, right? As if you play a prank on someone and they are the sort of butt of some joke. So there are a number of different facets to understanding Finnegans Wake as a kinky text. It is at once concerned with play and joy and excess, while at the same time being marred in repression, anxiety, disgust, fear, and self-loathing. Therefore, Finnegans Wake teaches us, as well as leaves space for us to enjoy play that is at once innocent and benign, and at the same time sexually illicit and excessive. This is the reason we never kind of figure out what the crime of Finnegans Wake is. As such, I think this is a really helpful way for approaching Finnegans Wake because it helps one foreground the pleasure of the text, the extent to which it really exudes personality. So I think this idea of Finnegans Wake as a kinky text can be really incisive for understanding the reading experience. Understanding how Finnegans Wake privileges ambiguity, such as between the writer and reader, but just in general, the various happenings that happen in Finnegans Wake are defined by ambiguity, discontinuity, rupture, lacuna, occulting, différance, fleeing, dancing, and constantly exceeding through gesture. Right? It doesn't exceed through conceptual leaps without any sort of substance, but right, they are filled with concrete gestures. I'm reminded of Hölderlin's concept of the Buchstabe, of the solid word, which is very similar to what Stuart Gilbert has to say in his Prolegomena to Work in Progress that can be found in our examination, where he says that the word building of Work in Progress is founded on the rock of petrified language, of sounds with solid associations. And the solidity or ground, or the unground in a way, of Finnegans Wake language is desire, and all the excesses of feeling and affect. Therefore, I ask you to go forth not only in reading Finnegans Wake, but in any text, by focusing on the affective immediacy of desire and of the text which demands to exceed any interpretation. I think that this can really productively understand the experience that Joyce wants us to glean from Finnegans Wake, as well as the sort of political and ethical implications that we can take from the way that we interpret it. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting and helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me purchase all the varying books of various kinds and bring you all this wonderful secondary literature, but no pressure. Care about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.